A favorite pastime for me is scanning through some of the more, let's call it, melodramatic newspapers. Some of those stories are hilarious, even though they're written in all seriousness. Perhaps that's what makes it even funnier. I stumbled across a really crazy story, but the fact that it included an interview with an old homeless lady stirs up some sympathy in my mind. The mentally ill are, especially those who are homeless, often neglected by society. The tabloid journalist's name was Chloe Dorner, and after the story was rolling around in my head for a couple days, I decided to reach out to her. What I expected from a level-headed journalist is not what I heard when I spoke to her. It seemed that Doris Bain had made quite an impact on Chloe, and it seemed like she actually believed what she'd heard during her interview. Here is some of the background that Jane had for me. Doris Bain had led a pretty normal life, but when the 2008 global recession hit, it hit her hard. Doris lost her home and had no friends or family who could or would help her. Her only child was in the army and had been deployed in Afghanistan. She had not heard from him in over 2 years. Now, she believed that there was no way for him to find her, and her to find him. Most nights, Doris was able to get a bed in a small, little homeless shelter, and she used her money gained through begging to buy food. There is no way in which she could receive health care. The newspaper reported that there had been 5 deaths at the homeless shelter called Hope Remains. All the deaths had been of the elderly, who were also of poor health. No autopsies were carried out, and the majority of them were buried in a cemetery in unmarked graves. Doris and 2 other ladies at the shelter would always attend the burial, as there were no friends or family, and they thought that everyone should at least have someone there to celebrate their life and to mourn their death. 3 deaths, let alone 5, in a short period of time was more than just a coincidence. Chloe was concerned that no one was taking these deaths seriously, and that there was no investigation into the matter. She could understand why Doris's interview with the police have not been taken seriously. They sounded like the ramblings of a crazy person. This is where the interview gets interesting. Every time the police were at the shelter, they were given information by Doris, who was roommates with the first 3 persons who passed away. Doris was interviewed for the first 2 deaths, but the deaths were ruled natural causes, and after that she was not taken seriously at all. She claimed that there were forces at work that had to be stopped. She knew more people were going to die until the cup was destroyed. She refused to touch it, but the police didn't even give the cup a second glance. At this point, I decided that I would look for Doris myself and get the whole story from her directly. She was actually quite easy to find. All the homeless on the streets of the city knew who she was because of the newspaper article. Doris Bain was a short little lady, 64 years old. She looked much older than she was, but living on the streets ages people quickly. Doris was at the shelter, and she was eager to tell her story to anyone who would listen. I was prepared to take a bag of salt with whatever I heard from Doris. After the first death, when the elderly gentleman, Ben Taylor, was taken by the coroner, he appeared incredibly emaciated and dehydrated, almost as if the fluids in his body had been siphoned away. He had not looked that way before touching the cup, according to Doris. She said that Ben had been in good health when he came into the room. He had then started unpacking some things from his bag, stuff that had been found in dustbins and dumpsters, that he had hoped that he could sell for a penny or 2. One of the 2 items was wrapped in a lot of bubble wrap, and Ben hadn't even opened it up yet. When he opened up the bubble wrap, he found a cup, just a plain, white, ordinary cup. As he turned the mug around in his hands, he suddenly let out a shout of pain. Ben's eyes opened wide, and he looked genuinely scared. It appeared that Ben's hand had become stuck to the mug somehow. The more he pulled his hand away from the cup, the more the cup seemed to stick to his hand. He was becoming more and more frantic, and his voice became dried out rasp. Ben kept saying that he was thirsty and begging Doris to bring him water. When she brought him a glass, he was unable to drink it. The water wouldn't go in his mouth at all, and just messed down his shirt. When Doris was standing so close to Ben, she smelled something incredibly disgusting and started gagging. They both looked into the cup and looked like urine was in it. Doris moved back quickly, and to her utter disgust, Ben put the cup to his mouth and drank the contents. He gagged and nearly threw up. When he looked up, he looked into Doris's eyes and said that he was so thirsty that he had to drink something. It looked like the mug had refilled. Ben tried to drink more from the cup, but he gagged too much. After a couple minutes of trying to drink water and then trying to drink from the cup, but not being able to because of the gagging, he collapsed to the floor. The mug disappeared, and when Doris turned to the door to call for help, she saw a wine glass on the table next to her bed that she had not put there. After the coroner's office had come to fetch Ben's body, the police interviewed her. She wasn't sure what the point was. They wrote nothing down. According to her, the questions were very wishy-washy, and they seemed completely uninterested in anything she had to say. Doris then left the shelter to get some fresh air, as the room still smelled like urine. A couple hours later, Doris returned to the room that she was staying in. She opened the door, and on the floor was an elderly lady. She was very obviously dead. Doris screamed for help. The coroner's office sent another hearse, and the police came back. While waiting to be questioned, she looked around. There was nothing on the ground in the room. She walked closer and was horrified and disgusted. It looked and smelled like human feces. On the table was a small milk jug that smelled like the stuff on the floor. She wondered if it belonged to the old lady. The police who responded were the same two officers, and they looked even less interested in anything Doris had to say. With a lot of gratitude from Doris, the cleaner who worked for the shelter came in and cleaned the floor. When he reached for the jug to clean around it, Doris let out a cry and told him not to touch it. He asked if it was her jug, and when she said no, he picked up the jug. He let out a yelp, and the skin seemed to fuse with the jug, as had happened with Ben, and Doris suspected the lady who had been taken away. The cleaner was trying everything to get the jug off his hand. There was a strange smell in the air, something like the smell of blood. He was slowly looking scrawny, like his bodily fluids were being drained from him. The cleaner was going crazy, drinking whatever was in the drug, but not being able to remove it at all. He hit his hand on the window, which shattered. When he pulled his hand back, there were thousands of scratches on his hand. But after he shook his hand like mad again, they had both looked at his hand. The scratches below his wrist were all healed. Trying to smash the jug against the table or floor didn't work. Nothing was working. He went running out of the room, and Doris had climbed onto her bed and sat in the corner of the room with her head in her hands. She knew then that it was the mug/wineglass/milk jug that was doing this. That it was all the information Doris had for me. She knew that the cleaner had died shortly after she last saw him. This death was quickly followed by 2 more of the kitchen workers. The police looked at her suspiciously, but because she had been nowhere near the last 2 victims, their interest in her didn't last long. I was interested in what the police made of all of this, so I popped down to the public records office. The death records have no autopsy reports, and only a generic reports from the investigators. It was decided that the deaths had all been natural causes, old age and poor health due to the persons coming in off the streets. I was incredulous how they could possibly believe that. I've come again to the same conclusion as I had before all of this. The mentally ill, the hopeless, and the elderly are harshly treated by a cruel world. So, we have a creepy fluid vessels that kill people, as Doris would say. When you listen to a story, You can't help but get roped into a belief. At the end of the day, it's just not possible, and this may very well become a myth on the streets. Then we have the official theory that it was just a whole lot of elderly people who possibly died of natural causes. It seems like too much of a coincidence to me. The theory that makes more sense to me is that there was a contagious infection that spread through the shelter where all the symptoms started to show at the same time. The symptoms appear to include hallucination, paranoia, and hysteria. It's possible that Doris had been infected but managed to survive. Worryingly, if this is the case, then there will be more deaths to come. I hope it was just an unfortunate coincidence, but time will tell. This is Secrets, Crime, and Paranormal, signing out.